Doug Everly crash-landed into the middle of an alien market, wearing only one boot, holding a half-eaten granola bar, and yelling something about explosive cheese. Shoppers screamed and scattered, toppling crates of purple fruit and small robotic pets that barked in binary. A towering four-eyed merchant pointed a plasma rifle at him and demanded identification. Doug, bleeding slightly from the forehead, lifted the granola bar and said, "I'm Doug the Destroyer. And I demand tribute. Preferably with caramel." No one moved. Then, from the crowd, a tiny green child gasped, "It's really him!" And just like that, everything went to hell. 2 weeks earlier, Doug had been aggressively arguing with a vending machine that refused to dispense his protein bar. That argument escalated when he punched the panel, broke 3 knuckles, and was subsequently arrested by a security drone that mistook him for a domestic terrorist. His protests were ignored. "I just wanted almonds, man!" he'd shouted, dangling upside down in the drone's cargo net. In hindsight, Doug wished he had stayed arrested. When he finally stood before the Earth Prime Council, his left arm in a cast and his patience evaporated, the first thing he said was, "Let me guess. You need someone dumb enough to take a suicide mission, and I'm top of the list?" The council members, all dressed in identical charcoal uniforms and smug expressions, didn't laugh. One of them, a woman with steel-gray hair and the vocal warmth of a guillotine, slid a dossier toward him. "You're going to New Terra." Doug flipped it open. Pictures of smoking buildings, terrified civilians, and something that looked like a rhinoceros in body armor stared back at him. Wait. These guys? These are the galactic warlords of Skarnath or something?" "Skarnath," corrected another council member, without enthusiasm. "And yes, they've taken the colony. We need an infiltrator. A small presence. One man." Doug blinked. "Okay, yeah, but why me? I fly boxes. Badly. You remember that time I delivered a shipment of live goats to a wedding instead of an embassy? I still get death threats from that ambassador." "We're aware," the woman said. "That's why you're perfect. They won't see you coming. Because I'm completely unqualified?" "Exactly." Doug had considered many career paths in his life. Galactic spy had never been one of them. "Do I at least get weapons? A team? Some kind of cool spy gadgets?" The answer was no, and only if you counted a coffee mug that said, "World's okayest pilot." They gave him a ship. Sort of. It was a retrofitted scout cruiser named Sadie that wheezed when it started and had an onboard AI so sarcastic Doug thought it might actually be sentient. "Great," Sadie greeted him on first contact. "Another hero with no clue and a god complex. Can't wait to die beside you." The ship smelled like old socks and freeze-dried chili. Doug named his cabin the Dungeon of Regret. The mission briefing was sparse: infiltrate the planet, assess the warlord threat, and destabilize them from within. "Destabilize how?" Doug had asked. "Socially? Emotionally? Should I insult their fashion choices?" "Figure it out," the council had replied. "You're clever. Or at least, annoyingly persistent." He didn't even make it to New Terra on the first try. A rogue wormhole swallowed Sadie like a popcorn kernel and spat them out near a star that blinked suspiciously. "Well," said Sadie, "statistically you should be dead now. I am deeply disappointed." They adjusted course. The journey took 3 days. Doug spent most of it trying to figure out if the AI was bluffing about the oxygen levels dropping every time he made a joke. By the time he entered New Terra's atmosphere, he was sleep-deprived, underfed, and panicking internally. So when the automated planetary defenses lit up like Christmas, he screamed, "Evasive maneuvers!" and yanked the controls hard enough to sprain his shoulder. The landing was more of a crash. Several fruit stands were harmed. And now, here he was, posing as a mythical warlord in front of 30 terrified aliens and trying not to cry. A greenskin merchant approached him slowly, eyes wide. You are Doug the Destroyer?" Doug looked around. Behind him, the ship belched smoke. He had blood in one eye and an angry blister from a coffee spill on his neck. "Yes," he said, standing as tall as he could while leaning on a crate. And I've come to liberate this colony. With extreme snacking. The crowd erupted in whispers. A chant started. Doug! 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 He hadn't felt this popular since he accidentally uploaded a video of himself dancing in zero gravity with no pants. That had gone viral for all the wrong reasons. Later, when the panic died down and he found himself in a rebel safe house, which was really just a smelly basement under an abandoned diner, he met the local resistance. They were 3 humans and a creature called Fleep, who insisted he was a wizard and tried to bless Doug with a mop. So, said one of the humans, a wiry woman named Lena, you're the elite assassin Earth sent to save us? Doug glanced at the mop. Yep. That's me. Doug the Destroyer. Slayer of bad guys. Totally trained. Definitely not a delivery guy with commitment issues. Fleep lit his own beard on fire. No one noticed. Doug stared at the flickering lights above him, a sinking feeling in his gut. He had no plan, no backup, and no business being here. But people were looking at him like he mattered. Like he could save them. And somehow, that felt heavier than the crash, the warlords, or even the vending machine betrayal. He sighed. All right. Let's start with names. Then maybe we teach me how to hold a weapon without hurting myself. As laughter rippled through the group, Doug knew one thing for sure. This was going to be the worst mission of his life. Or, possibly, the best mistake Earth ever made. Doug woke up on a pile of mismatched cushions in what he assumed was once a pizza parlor, now converted into the new Terra Resistance headquarters, which mostly consisted of half-broken chairs, questionable snacks, and a holographic map that occasionally flickered into an advertisement for an anti-aging cream. He blinked at the ceiling, still trying to convince himself that the previous day hadn't been a head injury-induced dream. He had crash-landed, gotten mistaken for a legendary warrior, and was now leading an underground rebellion. Against warlords. With weapons. Actual, functioning weapons. Probably. Maybe. Okay, technically one was a slingshot made of shoelaces and pipe parts, but still. Lena handed him a cup of something hot and vaguely brown. We call it coffee, she said, but it might be melted roof insulation. Doug took a sip and immediately gagged. Yep. Insulation with a hint of regret. She laughed and sat beside him, spreading out a map of the colony. This is all we've got. The warlords moved in 2 months ago. They didn't just take over. They rewired the whole power grid, shut down communications, and turned our spaceport into their personal nightclub. Doug squinted at a glowing section labeled Fort Scorch. Wait. They turned a colonial port into a club? Oh yeah? Apparently, the warlords of Skarnath love music. Loud, painful music. Every Thursday is blood-based night. One of them plays an instrument made entirely out of bones. Doug stared at her. That's either horrifying or metal as hell. She didn't blink. Both. He spent the next few hours meeting what passed for the resistance. There was Cal, a grumpy engineer who only spoke in growls and fixed weapons with bubblegum. Naira, a teenage tech genius who had once hacked a patrol drone using only a potato and a spoon. And Fleep, the squirrel-like creature who had now fashioned a wizard hat out of a soup can and insisted on casting spells, most of which caused minor property damage and one instance of spontaneous beard growth. Doug tried to act like he belonged, which mostly meant nodding and repeating phrases like tactical repositioning and supply chain disruption, while quietly trying not to cry. At some point, he wandered into the town square, trying to understand the scope of the occupation. The warlords had installed massive banners of themselves in dramatically heroic poses, complete with glowing eyes and laser swords. Patrols of armored beasts stomped through the streets. Civilians hurried out of their way, heads down. In a moment of dumb curiosity, Doug ducked behind a cart and watched one of the warlords exit a shop carrying a smoothie. He was at least 7 feet tall, wore golden armor with far too many spikes, and had a booming voice that said things like, "I demand a second straw," and Bring me the fruit of vengeance! Doug wasn't sure if he should be terrified or impressed. Possibly both. Back at the safe house, Lena handed him a small holopad. This is Zarin, the leader. The worst of them all. He believes in something called glorious single combat. He thinks war should be one-on-one battles between champions. So far, he's dueled 5 of our best fighters and turned them into modern art. Doug tilted his head. Single combat? So, if someone challenges him and wins, he leaves. The warlords have this weird honor code. Problem is, no one survived long enough to use it. He's brutal. Doug leaned back, rubbing his temples. What if I bluffed my way into a duel, and won using, say, complete and utter cheating? Lena looked at him. You're not serious. I am never serious, Doug said. And yet here we are. Let's make this bluff so good they can't ignore it. That night, they staged an accidental run-in at one of the smaller warlord outposts. Doug stumbled in, flanked by resistance members who pretended to be terrified minions. He wore a cloak made from repurposed curtains and carried a walking stick Naira had rigged to spark dramatically when he tapped it. When the warlord guard demanded his name, Doug slammed the stick on the ground and shouted, I am Doug the Destroyer! Slayer of planets! Eater of regret! Tell Zarin that his doom approaches! The guard blinked. Doug the who? The Destroyer! Doug repeated. Also, I'm here to challenge him to glorious single combat. He knows what this is about. It worked. Mostly because the warlords were bored and egotistical, and Zarin loved a dramatic entrance. The next day, an announcement was made across the colony's loudspeakers. Doug the Destroyer had arrived. Citizens were to prepare for a grand duel. Bets were already being placed. Back at the base, Lena paced in a frenzy. Do you have any idea what you've done? Not in the slightest, Doug admitted. But I have 3 days to train. That's like a full trilogy in movie terms. Training with what? Philippe's imaginary spells? Actually, Philippe said, floating by on a hover mop, I've been working on a ritual of moderate protection. It involves glitter and humming loudly. Perfect, Doug said. We'll call it Plan B. The next few days were a chaotic mess of improvised training. Doug learned to swing a staff without knocking himself unconscious. He discovered that Cal's bubblegum explosives were unpredictable but surprisingly effective against trees. Sadie, still orbiting the planet and mocking him daily, sent down a care package that included a taser disguised as a sandwich. For when diplomacy fails, she wrote in the note. Doug named it Toasty. But doubts crept in. On the last night before the duel, Doug sat alone on a rooftop, staring at the alien stars. Lena joined him, holding 2 mugs of melted insulation coffee. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. Yeah, I do, he replied. I lied to everyone. They believed in someone who doesn't exist. But if I can take Zarin down, even by faking it, they'll believe they can stand up again. That's worth it. She smiled faintly. You're not who we expected. But maybe you're what we needed. Doug sipped the coffee and winced. Nope. Still terrible. As the sun rose over New Terra, the colony buzzed with anticipation. The square was cleared for the duel. Zarin arrived in full battle regalia, riding a genetically engineered beast that looked like a rhinoceros had married a disco ball. Doug arrived late, wearing mismatched armor, half a cloak, and holding Toasty like it was a sword. The crowd watched in stunned silence. Doug the Destroyer, Zarin bellowed. Prepare to meet your glorious end. Doug took a deep breath. He had no plan. No team. Just a taser sandwich, a wizard with a mop, and a planet full of people waiting for a miracle. He grinned. Let's dance, Sparkles. The crowd erupted as soon as Doug tripped over his own feet and fell flat on his face. Not exactly the grand opening he'd envisioned. Zarin, towering and menacing in his armor made of obsidian plates and shimmering threads of light, stood at the center of the dueling circle like a monument to excessive gym routines. Doug groaned, pushed himself up, and gave a sheepish wave to the onlookers. Just checking the gravity, he muttered, brushing sand off his mismatched shoulder plates. Somewhere behind him, Fleet began humming a war chant that sounded suspiciously like an old Earth sitcom theme. Zarin pointed a blade the size of a car door at him. You are an insult to the warrior tradition. I shall crush your bones and use your spine to stir my morning stew. Doug raised a hand, looking for a pause button in the sky. First of all, that's deeply disturbing. Second, what kind of stew requires a spinal stirrer? Are you guys okay? Zarin didn't answer. He charged. Doug squealed and rolled out of the way, fumbling for the handle of Toasty, his taser sandwich. He pressed it just as Zarin swung, and to his utter disbelief, the shock went off. It wasn't enough to take Zarin down, but it surprised him enough to make him stumble. Doug scrambled to his feet, shouted, "Flanking maneuver!" to no one, and ran in a circle. The duel became less of a fight and more of a series of increasingly ridiculous attempts by Doug to not die. He dodged by slipping on a dropped hot dog. He parried by throwing his makeshift staff and accidentally knocking Zarin's helmet sideways. He even tried diplomacy mid-duel, shouting compliments like, "Nice sword technique," and "Really love what you've done with your shoulder spikes." But in between the chaos, something strange happened. The crowd started cheering for him. Not because he was winning, but because he was still standing. Zarin grew more enraged with every second. "You mock this sacred battle!" he roared. "You are not a warrior!" Doug, panting and bleeding from the lip, held up a hand. "You're right. I'm not. But maybe that's why I'm still here." Before Zarin could react, a low whine sounded through the square. Doug turned in time to see one of the warlord's ships lift off in a panic, smoke trailing from its underbelly. Then another. Then three. Cal's voice buzzed in Doug's earpiece. "We're in the vault. Naira found something. Big. Real big." Doug took advantage of Zarin's momentary distraction and dove toward the edge of the ring. "Time out!" he shouted. "Emergency! Planet-threatening emergency! I know that wasn't in the rulebook, but surely you guys have some kind of clause for imminent doom?" Zarin blinked, paused, then growled. "What have you done?" Doug didn't wait to answer. He sprinted across the square, snatched up Fleep, who was in the middle of casting a spell involving confetti, and bolted toward the rebel transport. 10 minutes later, he was standing in front of a vault deep beneath the former council building. Inside, glowing with eerie light, floated the chrono dagger. It was a long, jagged device embedded in a crystalline sheath, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to echo through the walls. Naira stood beside it, eyes wide. "It's Earth tech," she said. "Pre-Exodus. I dug into its signature. This thing's been locked here for over a century. It manipulates time." Doug scratched his head. "Why the hell would Earth hide a time weapon on a colony?" Lena stepped forward, arms crossed. "Maybe they weren't hiding it. Maybe they abandoned it. Left it here hoping it'd never be found. Then why were the warlords guarding it?" Doug asked. "Not guarding it," Cal grunted. "Containing it." Doug stared at the dagger. It shimmered. For a split second, he saw a flash of a ruined Earth, crumbling cities reversed in time and replayed like a broken tape. He stepped back. "Okay, nope. I vote we throw this thing into the sun." Naira shook her head. "Too late. It's unstable. That duel drew power from somewhere, and this thing is waking up." Just then, the floor shook. A holographic display flickered on the wall behind them, showing Zarin entering the building with a full war squad. "Give me the dagger," he growled, voice echoing through the chamber. "You fools don't understand what you're playing with." Doug looked at the others, then back at the display. "I'm starting to think he's not as evil as we thought. Which is deeply confusing." Lena grabbed his shoulder. "We need to move. We can't let this thing fall into anyone's hands, including ours." They ran. The dagger was placed into a containment pod, which Naira carried while simultaneously reprogramming it to not explode. Doug tried to help by carrying the snacks and offering encouragement. "We're doing great. Everything's only slightly on fire. The escape route led them through the underbelly of the city, into a network of old maintenance tunnels. Doug took point, mostly because he was the only one dumb enough to charge into unknown corridors. Behind him, Fleep hummed softly, hands glowing with what Doug was now pretty sure was some kind of actual energy. "Okay," he whispered. "You might really be a wizard. I'm just saying." They emerged in a disused spaceport bay. It looked abandoned, but as they crossed toward the ship, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was Varro, one of the rebels. The one who'd always seemed too smooth, too quiet. He raised his weapon and smiled. "Hand it over." Lena froze. "You're with them?" Varro shook his head. "Not exactly. I'm with whoever pays more. And right now, that dagger's worth enough to buy a moon." Doug stepped forward, hands raised. "Okay, let's not do anything rash. I don't want to be shot today. I had other plans. Like not dying." Behind Varro, more mercenaries emerged. Doug counted at least 6. "So, fun idea," he said to Lena. "What if we just gave him a fake dagger and ran screaming into the distance?" Unfortunately, Naira was already sliding the pod behind her back. Fleep let out a low squeak, then launched himself at the nearest mercenary, screaming something in a language that might have been made up, or ancient, or both. Chaos erupted. Doug ducked, grabbed a wrench, and began swinging wildly. He knocked one guy unconscious by pure luck, then tripped over another. Shots rang out. Sparks flew. In the midst of it all, Sadie buzzed into his earpiece. "I've hacked the bay doors. You've got 15 seconds before they open and vent everything." Doug screamed. "Everyone TO the ship!" and ran. The resistance scrambled aboard as the bay doors creaked. Varro lunged for the dagger but missed, slipping on Fleep's spilled glitter. Doug punched the launch button just as the doors blew open, sucking Varro and his crew into the void. They were free. For now. On board, Doug slumped into a seat, panting. Lena sat beside him, cradling the pod. "So. That was awful." Doug nodded. "I almost died. Twice. I think I dislocated something. Also, I might be in love with that dagger. Is that weird?" Fleep floated by, upside down. "The dagger dreams. It dreams of broken stars." Doug looked at him. "Yeah, okay, that's the creepiest thing anyone said all day. And Zarin called me a stew spoon." Naira leaned in. "Where do we go now?" Doug stared out the window, at the stars swirling beyond the glass. Somewhere out there, warlords wanted his head. Earth had no idea what was happening, and the most powerful time weapon in the galaxy was now in his possession. He took a deep breath. "No," he said. "We start a galactic rebellion. But first, snacks." Doug stood on the edge of the observation deck, staring down at the lush plains of New Terra below. The planet looked peaceful from up here, like a postcard no one had mailed. You'd never guess there were warlords down there holding civilians hostage and throwing weekly gladiator nights. He sighed, half-eaten energy bar in hand, and listened to Sadie list his current bounty totals. "Congratulations," the ship's AI said dryly. "You're now wanted on 4 planets, 2 moons, and 1 artificial habitat shaped like a duck. Zarin personally offered 12,000 credits and a ceremonial muffin for your capture." "Only 12? Doug muttered. "I'm insulted. I faked a duel, stole a doomsday weapon, and turned a spaceport into a glitter bomb." "You were on fire for a brief moment," Sadie added. "Exactly. Undervalued." He turned as Lena entered, looking as exhausted as he felt. Her armor was scuffed, one side of her hair had clearly been cut with a multi-tool, and she still managed to look like she had everything under control. Doug envied that. She handed him a small data slate. "We intercepted a signal. Zarin's calling for a final battle. Open broadcast. He wants to finish this with another duel. In the central arena. He says it's the only way to end things." Doug raised an eyebrow. "Did he mention whether it's a trap? Because I feel like I've earned at least one honest invitation." "He mentioned honor, destiny, And some poetic nonsense about stars bleeding. So yeah, it's a trap. Doug exhaled slowly. And we're walking into it anyway. Of course, she said, smiling faintly. You're the face of the rebellion. You can't run now. That's a shame, he muttered. Running was very much my first instinct. They spent the next 2 days preparing. Doug trained with Cal and Naira, who still refused to take him seriously as a warrior but helped anyway. Cal fitted him with new gear, including shock pads in the gloves and a hidden dart launcher in the left boot. You'll forget it's there, Cal warned. Until you kick yourself in the shin. Doug did exactly that 6 minutes later. Naira tried to teach him evasive maneuvers using a VR sim that resembled an angry laundry machine. Doug failed most of them, but survived long enough to trigger a victory condition by accidentally headbutting a robot. Fleep, ever enthusiastic, insisted on casting a courage enchantment, involving salt, a lizard, and singing. Doug woke up with a glowing nose and a sudden craving for spicy peanuts. Whether or not it worked, he couldn't tell, but it did make him feel oddly ready. On the morning of the duel, Doug stood with the others on a hill overlooking the arena. The central square of New Terra had been cleared. The warlords had gathered in full regalia, a shining sea of spikes, fangs, and questionable shoulder armor. Zarin waited at the center, arms crossed, eyes glowing. Doug took a deep breath and looked at his team. Lena. Cal. Naira. Fleep. Even Sadie's voice came through his earpiece offering tactical support and light sarcasm. He wasn't alone anymore. That part terrified him more than being alone ever had. Because now it mattered if he failed. He stepped into the arena to thunderous silence. Zarin greeted him with a slow nod. You returned, Doug the Destroyer. After your disgraceful flight. I had to moisturize, Doug said, stepping forward. Can't destroy empires with chapped hands. The warlord's lips curled slightly. You joke even now. It's a coping mechanism, Doug replied, drawing his staff. You should try it. The crowd of civilians, rebels, and warlords watched in absolute silence as the duel began. This time, Doug wasn't flailing. He wasn't graceful either, but he'd learned a few things. He dodged. He parried. He used Cal's gloves to shock Zarin mid-swing, knocking the larger man off balance. They circled each other, exchanging blows and insults. You're surprisingly nimble, Zarin said between strikes. For someone shaped like a question mark. Doug grunted, sidestepping a heavy strike. I stretch now. It's part of my warrior glow-up. Zarin came in fast. Doug ducked, rolled, and activated the dart in his boot, striking the warlord in the thigh. Zarin staggered but didn't fall. You fight dirty. I fight alive, Doug said, panting. There's a difference. Then came the twist. One of the warlords in the crowd moved, subtly at first, but enough to raise suspicion. Sadie's voice crackled in Doug's ear. Doug, incoming interference. The duel's a distraction. They're activating something near the old vault. Doug's blood ran cold. The chrono dagger? Possibly. Or something worse. He turned to Zarin. You're stalling. Why? The warlord hesitated. I gave the order to protect the dagger, not use it. But someone doesn't agree. That's when explosions rang out behind the arena. Panic erupted. Civilians fled. The warlords looked confused, and some turned on each other. Lena's voice burst over comms. Varro's back. He has a private army. He's going for the dagger. Doug looked at Zarin. We call a timeout? Zarin gave a grudging nod. Go. Stop this. Doug ran. The fight was over, but the war wasn't. The team regrouped near the vault as Varro's forces closed in. The traitor was in full combat armor, flanked by mercenaries and a stolen warlord walker. I told you this thing was worth more than loyalty. He sneered, pointing at the containment pod. Doug stepped forward, bruised and limping. You really need to learn to let go. That dagger's going to kill us all. Only if it's misused, Varro replied. And I plan to use it perfectly. Doug sighed. That's never a good line. You ever notice that? People say stuff like that right before everything explodes. Varro raised a hand. Kill him. But before they could fire, a thunderous boom shook the vault. Zaren's forces arrived, not as conquerors, but as allies. The battlefield blurred as enemies became partners, chaos became strategy, and the rebels fought beside warlords to stop the greater threat. Doug found himself face to face with Varro again. They fought, fists and fury, no gadgets, no tricks. Just old-fashioned anger. Doug, driven by exhaustion, rage, and a strange sense of responsibility, finally knocked Varro out cold with the staff he'd once used to bluff his way into legend. With the traitor down, the chrono dagger pulsed dangerously. Naira shouted warnings about instability. Doug, breathing hard, looked at the weapon and said, "We need to bury this. Forever." Zaren nodded. "I know where it can be sealed. Far from this galaxy. A place even the warlords dare not tread." Together, they launched the dagger into deep space, enclosed in a containment pod guided by Sadie's AI. As it vanished, Doug felt something lift from his chest. He turned to his allies, his accidental family. Lena walked up and clapped him on the back. "You did it." Doug shook his head. "We did it. I just made it look chaotic." Fleep squeaked. "The stars hum again. The soup has been stirred." Everyone paused. Doug raised a hand. "No one ask? Just go with it." And for the first time, New Terra felt like it could breathe again. Doug had never been celebrated before. Not properly. Sure, there was that one time someone clapped when he delivered a shipment of therapy llamas without accidentally opening the crates, but that had been more relief than admiration. This was different. He stood on a makeshift stage in the middle of New Terra's central plaza, surrounded by thousands of cheering colonists, rebels, and even a few former warlords who had somehow traded their armor for flower garlands. A giant banner reading, "Doug the Destroyer, Rebuilder of Worlds," hung above him, complete with an awkward caricature of his face and a heroic chin he definitely didn't have. Someone handed him a drink in a cup shaped like his own head. He wasn't sure if that was flattering or alarming. Lena nudged him, smirking. "Enjoy it. You've earned this." Doug shook his head slowly, still holding the cup. "I lied my way into a war, barely survived a duel, and mostly improvised my victories with tasers and snacks. I don't think that qualifies as heroism." "It does now," she said, and the crowd roared again as a group of children danced around Fleep, who was declaring himself Archmage of Peace, and summoning bubbles with what Doug was almost certain was a repurposed soda can. Behind them, Naira projected holograms of the Chrono Dagger's final launch, set to music that included at least one old Earth boy band track, which Doug found both disturbing and strangely moving. Later that night, long after the fireworks had ended and the crowd had drifted off into laughter and sleep, Doug sat on the roof of the old council building, legs dangling, sipping something warm and probably questionably legal. Sadie's voice buzzed in his ear, soft and unusually sincere. "Still breathing. Impressive." "Barely," Doug muttered. "You know, this all started because I punched a vending machine. A true origin story for the ages." He chuckled, looking at the stars. "They think I'm a leader now. What do I do with that? You adapt. Or run. Statistically, running has slightly higher survival odds." Doug was quiet for a moment. Below, the city lights shimmered with life. People were rebuilding. Smiling. For the first time in weeks, there were no explosions. No mercenaries. No doom-hungry weapons threatening to unravel time. Just hope. Messy, uncertain, fragile hope. He found Lena again the next morning, overseeing reconstruction of the main energy grid. She was yelling at a warlord about wiring safety while simultaneously rewiring it herself. Doug leaned against a post and watched her for a moment before clearing his throat. "Hey. So, about what's next?" She wiped sweat from her brow and gave him a tired smile. "Leaving already?" Doug shrugged. "That depends. I've got a ship with a sassy AI and a mostly functional propulsion system. Technically, I could vanish into the stars by lunch. And yet you're still here. He looked down at his boots, scuffed and dusty. Yeah. It's weird, but I think I want to stay a little longer. Not because they need me. Because maybe I need this. All of it. The people. The chaos. The sense that I did something right for once. Lena smiled. Well, in that case, we've got plumbing issues on the east side and a rogue goat that keeps eating solar panels. Doug saluted. Send me in. Over the next few weeks, Doug found himself busier than ever. Not as a soldier or a destroyer, but as something new. A fixer. A negotiator. An accidental leader. He helped mediate peace talks between the remaining warlords and the colony leaders, which mostly involved food bribes and translating aggressive threats into something vaguely polite. He trained rebel recruits using every lesson he'd learned, mostly what not to do. He and Fleep started a weekly broadcast called Doug and the Wizard, where they answered colonists' questions and occasionally sang impromptu songs about galactic safety protocols. Against all logic, it became a hit. Then, one morning, Sadie summoned him to the ship with an urgent tone. Doug arrived expecting an emergency, only to find her projecting a news feed from Earth. He stood frozen as he read the headlines. Earth honors fallen hero, Doug the Destroyer declared lost in battle. New memorial serial launched. Below the text was a picture of a Doug-shaped breakfast mascot giving a thumbs up. The cereal was called Crunch of Destiny. Doug stared at it for a long moment, then collapsed into the pilot's seat and groaned. They made me a breakfast food. Posthumously, Sadie added. Might I suggest haunting them? Doug laughed bitterly. They didn't even wait to see if I made it. Just assumed I died and turned me into sugar. It's on sale. Kids love it. He leaned back, watching the video of Earth kids munching on tiny frosted Doug heads, and felt something strange. Not anger. Not even disappointment. Just a kind of relief. Earth had moved on. Maybe that meant he could, too. He called a meeting later that day. Lena, Naira, Cal, and even Zarin, now slightly less terrifying and considerably more mellow, gathered in the old command center. Doug paced awkwardly, hands in pockets. So, I've got a proposal. Cal grunted. Is it terrible? Almost definitely, Doug said. But hear me out. Earth thinks I'm dead. Which means I'm free. No more background checks. No more fines for misplaced shipments. No one to tell me I can't fly through asteroid fields just to shave 2 minutes off delivery time. I say we take Sadie, turn her into a proper ship, and start something new. Lena raised an eyebrow. New how? Not a rebellion. Not an army. A crew. We go where people need help. We fix things. Solve problems. Make a mess, clean it up, maybe save a few lives in between. Galactic handyman stuff. With style. Naira grinned. I'm in. Cal shrugged. As long as I get to blow something up now and then. Fleep raised his paw. Can we have a theme song? Doug smiled. Only if I get to sing it badly. And just like that, they weren't rebels anymore. They were something else. Something new. A crew. A family of misfits with no one to report to and nowhere to go but forward. That night, Doug stood on the ramp of the ship, watching the city fade behind them as Sadie prepared for launch. He felt nervous. Excited. A little queasy. Probably the goat cheese from lunch. Lena joined him, hands in her jacket. Still think you're not a hero? Doug looked at the stars. Oh, I know I'm not. I'm something worse. I'm an optimist now. Sadie's engines hummed, and the ship lifted from the ground. As they soared into the night sky, Doug turned back one last time, whispering under his breath. So long, vending machine. Look where you got me. And the stars welcomed them home.